Today I'm going to walk you through the Akai S900 digital MIDI sampler from 1986. This is fairly comparable to the S950, so most of the functions on the S900 should also work on the S950. If you're only after help on a particular feature, use the index markers in the description area below or along the timeline. But if you find the clip useful, let me know by hitting the thumbs up, subscribe, and check out the channel for more walkthroughs just like this one. The S900 represents the first of the professional S-Series samplers from Akai, despite the fact it came out a year after Akai's first S-Series sampler, the S612, which was fairly limited in comparison and not really considered a professional grade instrument. But the S900 introduced some core features to the series, like the 8 individual outputs, that have mostly featured throughout the entire range of Akai samplers still to this day. At the core, the S900 is an 8-voice 12-bit sampler that comes factory stocked with a maximum of 750 kilobytes of onboard memory, giving you a maximum of 63 seconds sample time, which is widely publicised, but that's actually at its lowest sample rate of a mere 3 kHz. Alternatively, you can choose a much higher sample rate of up to 16 kHz, but that additional bandwidth comes at a much higher cost to the onboard memory, and so recording at 16 kHz leaves you with a mere 11.75 seconds of sample time. But the good thing is the S900 offers variable sample rates for you to record in. So you can nominate any particular sample rate or bandwidth, as the S900 labels it, between 3 kHz up to 16 kHz. If you're using the last available operating system, as I am here on version 4, you can have up to 32 samples in memory at any one time and up to 64 key groups, which allow you to build drum kits, layer samples or loops, and apply envelopes and filters to your samples in many different ways. And the filters on board the S900 and the S950 are digitally controlled analog filters, and probably the main reason why people still value these samples some 35 years after their debut. But for those looking to compare the S900 to the S950, the S950 expanded on some of the existing features in the S900, like upgradable memory. So you can upgrade the S950 up to 2.25 megabytes of RAM, allowing almost 10 seconds of sample time at a much higher sample rate of 19.2 kHz. There's an extended cache for samples and programs, allowing 99 of each. Plus, there's an optional SCSI interface available for mass storage devices. The factory disk drive on the S950 were 3.5-inch high-density floppy drives, which can store 1.44 megabytes, opposed to the 900's double-density drive that could save 720 kilobytes. But if you're using a floppy disk drive emulator, like a Gotek HXC, then you don't really have much to worry about. And there was an interesting component to the S900 not found on the S950, which was the optional audio trigger accessory, the ASK90, and that gave you the ability to trigger samples with raw audio via a 1/4-inch jack, which is fundamentally an audio to MIDI trigger. So some may have used that during live performances, along with Syn drums or Simmons pads, maybe even a guitar for triggering samples inside the S900. The S950 introduced a similar method of functionality with an external MIDI device from Akai, which was the ME35T. But I imagine the ASK90 would have been much more snappier and responsive than the MIDI-connected ME35T. Last of all, both the S900 and S950 can do MIDI over an RS-232C serial port, but you'd need some older computer like an Atari ST or modified hardware to make use of that. But even still, I'm betting they'd be a little more robust than communication over regular MIDI cables. And this serial port has been given a new lease on life with a bunch of third-party applications floating around that allow you to do some interesting tricks like transferring WAV files into the S900 via Windows and Mac operating systems. I'll leave some links to those in the description area below, along with some additional information regarding operating systems and other useful things for owners of the 900 that may be watching. There's no denying some prefer the S950 over the 900 for the beefier specs, obviously, but both are monumentally revered for being behind some of the biggest hits in hip-hop, rap, soul and R&B of the late 80s and 90s. So let's get into the workflow concept of the S900. Most Akai samplers use virtual containers, referred to as programs, to manage placeholders for samples known as key groups. Those key groups access your samples that reside in the 900's memory, and so the key groups are really just responsible for applying configurational settings to your samples upon playback, such as pitch, transpose, LFO, filters, envelopes, and key span ranges, which can be any particular section of keys spanning a keyboard, nominated by a low key position up to a high key position. And while the key groups can reference any samples in the S900's memory, they, or the programs for that matter, don't store the physical sample data. For this reason, you can save all load programs independently of the samples themselves. But in case there's any confusion, the key group parameters do belong to programs, and so they too are saved as part of your programs. Using the arrow keys, you can move your cursor left or right. With each press, you'll skip to the next field in either direction, and depending on the type of field, you can use the control dial here to scroll through the options related to that particular field. Furthermore, this solid flashing cursor you can see here is indicating that you can modify this particular field. And you can see this other arrow cursor, and that arrow indicates the feature you can operate. So in this case, we're on the page number. Pressing our cursor once to the right, we're now on the select or copy function. Pressing arrow again, and we're now on rename or delete. And delete is denoted by this little minus symbol here, indicating to us that we can hit the minus key to execute the delete function, which would then delete the program we have selected here. And we could change that selection by using the control dial, and then hitting in the ENT key for enter. So it's a good exercise to check where your cursors are as you arrive at each page. Depending on which page you're on, you may also have some additional fields that require an on-off command, and you can find the on-off buttons here at the bottom of your keypad. To navigate from page to page, you can press the page header buttons at any time. And if you press a page header button immediately followed by scrolling with your control dial, you can browse through the page index. Otherwise, if you know the exact number, you can punch in the 2-digit number and jump directly to any specific page you want. Some of the most common pages are laid out on this menu on the front panel. Alternatively, you can press up or down on the page arrows to scroll back and forwards through your list. And strangely enough, the page arrows function in reverse. So pressing the down arrow moves you up to page 2 and vice versa. Plus, as a shortcut, you can press any of the page header buttons to return you to the first page of any particular section. When you find your solid cursor over a title of some sort, that's indicating that you can make a change. For example, if it's over a name, like we have here, you can hit the letter button, and that will change the solid cursor into an underlined cursor. And this indicates you can now rename or modify the contents of that particular field to whatever you like. So here you can use your arrow keys along with the control dial to key in a new word, along with the space button to erase any other letters you may want to delete, followed by the enter key to enter in what you've done. So to copy, you rename the element on the top row, like I'm doing, and by doing this, you're essentially creating the file name that belongs to the copy. So pressing ENT on the keypad will initiate the copy automatically. Alternatively, if you're on a numerical field, you don't necessarily need to hit the letter button. You can just punch numbers in directly from the keypad or use the control dial. And you can also mix it up and use a bit of both, whichever helps you get there quicker. So let's take a look through the record section of the S900. Firstly, you want to make sure you've got a 1/4" jack connected to the line input on the front of the S900 and have some audio content queued from a line level mixer or maybe the output of your DAW's audio interface. If you've just powered on your sampler, hit the record page button here labelled REC, and you should see the page heading name of sample to be recorded with the word tone below. This will be the name of the next sample you record. So if you press the letter key here, you'll notice the solid square cursor becomes an underline, which is indicating to us that we can now edit the name. Using the left and right arrow keys, we can scroll through the alphabet using the control dial, and we can add some numbers from the keypad or even a minus symbol. Or we could even use the space button to erase what's currently there. Once we're finished, we just hit the ENT key on the keypad to enter in the new name. Hit the page down button to proceed to the next page, which is where you'll see the heading Name of Program for Monitoring with the word Monitor below it. Here you can select an already existing program for your new sample to be added into. Otherwise, you can just select Monitor to hear the signal while you're recording. And you can use this monitor dial here to adjust your monitoring level in real time. And it should be said, doing it this way will not add your newly recorded sample into any particular program. It'll just sit in the 900's memory until you add it to a particular program via the Edit Program section. Next, hit the page down button to proceed to the next page, which is Sample Type. Here we've got three options. Option 1 is a normal sample type, and below that we've got this curious looking velocity crossfade section. So before we go any further, I should quickly explain what this is for those that are unfamiliar with it. In the simplest of terms, a velocity crossfade sample is a dual layer sample that has a soft layer and a loud layer that you can allocate samples into, one in the loud and one in the soft. Then when you've got both allocated, you can set the velocity threshold that determines how much of each sample you'll hear when you hit the keys at different velocity levels. So if you hit the keys very gently, you'll just hear the soft sample. If you hit the keys very hard, you'll just hear the loud sample, hence the name velocity crossfade. But for this example, let's just go with option 1. So we can record a normal sample, and we'll come back to the soft and loud sample in a moment. So hit the page down button to proceed to the next page. Here we have the sample rate, or as the 900 labels it, the audio bandwidth page. Here we can nominate any particular sample rate we want to record in between 3000 Hz and 16,000 Hz, aka 3 kHz up to 16 kHz. So just as a tip, if you're unsure what to put in here, what I used to do is put an EQ with a steep 24 dB per octave high cut or steeper, and play whatever audio you're planning on recording into the S900 and sweep the EQ curve between 16 and 3K and figure out exactly what's too much or not enough top end. And once you're happy, you then punch that frequency number into this audio bandwidth page. And that'll give you a good idea of how much top end will be excluded from your sample. As a side note, this heading here, Previous, is there to display the last sample rate you used to record, which is very considerate of the 900. Next page we have is the recording time. By default we have 1000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. The maximum you can record for will vary depending on the sample rate you used on the previous page, but also minus the sum of all the sample time used on other samples in the 900's memory. So it's best to be frugal here. Time is a valuable commodity on the S900, so don't use what you don't need, and don't use a high sample rate if you can afford not to. So for this example, I'll just choose 4 seconds, which is 4000 milliseconds. Page down to the next page. Here we can instruct the S900 that the incoming audio should be calibrated to a particular note on a keyboard, which probably doesn't make a lot of sense if you're recording a dog barking, but if you're recording a note from a piano, then you'd want to nominate that incoming piano note to the corresponding note on your MIDI keyboard. If in doubt, just leave it on the default setting of C3. Moving on to the next page, Start With. Here we have a few options that can initiate the recording of our incoming audio, and they are option 1, any key, from this little dark grey section on the front panel. And with option 2 we have foot switch. So if we plug a sustain pedal, or like a Roland DP2 or this Yamaha, into this little pre-trigger socket here, we can trigger the recording from option 2 from a distance if you can't quickly reach over, or if you need to trigger the S900 into recording what you're about to play on a piano or something like that. Use a foot switch to manually drop the S900 into record. And last of all we have option 3, which is the audio level threshold option, which is what I use most of the time. So if we hit option 3 and prepare to record some audio, we can see the letter T sitting in the middle of the display here. And this is for trigger level or threshold. From this point, you can use your control dial to shift the threshold in either direction. But the threshold is responsible for tripping the S900 into record. And you can see on the top line a message telling you to hit any key when ready. But before you do that, just make sure to cue your audio and adjust your record level, which is this red pinkish dial here, and adjust that accordingly so that you've got plenty of gain on your incoming audio signal. Some people even like to push their signal quite hot and smash into the analog to digital converters, which for some is quite the delicacy as it adds a little crunch onto the signal coming in. And so these little dots that you can see up on the right hand side here, this is like your red zone where clipping can occur. And when audio starts playing, you'll see this display behaves like an audio meter. So you can gauge how much level you've got coming in, and you can get a good overview of the dynamics in your audio or where the peak of your audio is placed against that risky red zone or clipping area. But I'm quite sure clipping doesn't occur unless you smash into the far right hand side over here. So we'll just adjust the monitor. So when you hit the key to arm recording, the 900 will just wait patiently for your audio to meet that particular trigger level before it starts recording automatically. Then it will record for the duration we keyed in earlier, which in this case is 4 seconds. As a tip, if you need to cancel the recording at any time, just hit the record page header button here to return to page 1. As a side note, the last operating system implemented a pre-trigger system, which is like an audio buffer to capture a small amount of time just prior to the actual record start. Depending on your sample rate, if you're recording with, say for example, 16 kilohertz, a 50 millisecond pre-record buffer is retained just prior to that trigger level being tripped. If you're using a sample rate of 8 kilohertz, then a 100 millisecond pre-record buffer is retained. So ultimately, the pre-trigger preserves the attack at the beginning of your sample, which is particularly handy if your threshold cuts in just a tad too late and savages the beginning of your audio, which is what used to happen a lot of the time on the previous versions of the 900's operating system. So the advent of the pre-trigger feature retains that tiny moment in time just ahead of what triggers the threshold to start recording. And that's a feature of version 2 or version 4. So now that we've got that sample, I can play my MIDI keyboard that you can't really see here that's attached to the MIDI input on the rear of the S900. Or I can hit the playback button, PB here, to actually play back what we just recorded. So while we're here recording some samples, I think it's wise that we go back and record a soft sample and a loud sample, as we were talking about earlier. So let's go back to page 1 and give our second sample a meaningful name. So here we'll do a soft sample. So I'll lock in number 2 and we'll make this one 3 seconds. And let's cue it up. Okay, I'm happy with that. So let's arm the S900. And let's play that back. And play it on the MIDI keyboard. So now let's record a loud sample, return to the start, and give the loud sample a name. And this time it's going to be a loud sample, so number 3. And let's cue it up. Okay, so let's try that. It's a bit quiet, but that's due to the settings behind this playback button here that we'll visit a little later on. I think what we can do now is we can move on to the edit sample section. So moving on to page 1 of the edit sample section, here the page is called sample name, but it's actually more like the sample manager because you can copy, delete, rename, and select different samples that are inside the 900's memory. So if I wanted to hear that 808 beat that I did before, I could just cursor over to this little section here, dial in the 808, hit enter. I can now hit playback and listen to it. And so if I go up to the next page, here we've got the select program, which by default is set to monitor, which is our monitor output. But if you've configured your sample inside a program, like I have, I can select that particular program, which is called TONELAB here, enter that in. And now when I hit the playback, it's going to play the 808 through the lens of that particular program. So earlier on I set up some filters just so you can hear the difference. So now that 808 is going to go through the filters in this particular program. So we'll turn that back to monitor for now, for the sake of the tutorial, just so we've got control over the monitor here, the monitor output. So moving on to page 3 here, we can add a little loudness to our sample if it's too quiet. And we can change the nominal pitch. And we can adjust the fine tuning. Moving on to page 4, we've got the replay mode. On this page, you can configure your sample to loop continuously, or just play once using one shot, or have an alternating loop which plays once forwards, then backwards, and then repeats in that particular motion. So for here, I think we'll just use 2 for now, because we'll set this up to be a loop. And so moving up to the next page, page 5, which is our time direction. This is fairly straightforward. Here you can choose to have your sample play either forwards with option 1 or backwards with option 2 in reverse. So we'll leave that on normal for the moment, so it plays forwards. And then we'll go to page 6, which is our start point. This is where you define the exact point of where you want your sample to start playing from. So you can dial in any particular number up to this amount here on the left, but you can also skip to the auto feature here on the right to jump to the next available zero crossing in your waveform. So if I play down the far end of the keyboard so you can sort of hear this under the microscope. It's a bit more snappier there. And you can see the amount that it jumped to actually find that zero crossing. So that sounds pretty good. I'll leave that there. So that's quite useful to jump that air that might be in front of your actual waveform. So just as a tip, if you want to purge the excess from memory, you need to visit page 9 and discard the excess that we've got on the front of our sample now. So moving up to page 7, endpoint. This is where you define the end of your sample, and you can dial in any particular number allocated between the left and right markers here. And again, if you want to crop or discard that excess of your sample, you need to visit page 9. So moving on to page 8, now we've got the loop length. Here you can fine tune the length of your loop, and there's a handy little feature on the right here called auto, which is like an auto loop finder, which finds a nearby zero crossing in your waveform close by to the designated loop length that you put in, so your loops don't click when they cycle around. And again, if you're wondering why your loops aren't looping, make sure you visit page 4 and enable the playback mode to loop. Then determine the length of your loop and then cursor over to auto and hit the enter key. So if we were to try that now, not bad. Could be a little bit better, but that's good enough for the demo. All right, so let's keep moving. On page 9, so we've got a couple of options here. We've got resample at half bandwidth, and like many other processes on the S900, it's a destructive process. So make sure you copy or save your samples as a backup before running these sorts of options, because there's no undo on this old thing. So what we can do first is we'll discard before, start and after end of our sample. So that's like a trim or a crop process, which will discard any of the excess sample that we're not using, which is before the start point and obviously after the end point. So now let's try that resample at half bandwidth. And what this essentially does, it resamples the audio at half the bandwidth. So it drops the quality by 50%, but in doing that, it kind of frees up 50% of the memory at the same time. So let's audition that sample. So we lost all the top end, but it still sounds kind of crunchy and funny, so that's good. So moving on to page 10, we've got the splice crossfade. This feature has a few options, so it's spread across pages 10, 11 and 12, but as the name suggests, you can slice and fade samples together, and this second sample name is a sample you want faded or spliced onto the back of the currently selected sample back on page 1, which is what this PB button will play. So that's considered our first sample. And this new sample name field here will be the name for your newly rendered sample that blends the first or current sample, which is this, with the second sample there together. So key and a meaningful name if you're into good housekeeping. So moving on to page 11, the splice crossfade time is in microseconds. So here we have a little more than 24 milliseconds on offer. This value would mean the center between the two samples has about a 12 millisecond transition on either side of the two samples. So moving up to page 12, splice order. We have a few different options here. We've got the first and then second splice order option at number 1. And this is letting you know that the first sample, or the currently selected sample, which is this, will have the second sample we nominated on page 10, which is the ARPL, spliced onto the back of this. Then at number 2, we've got the reverse. We've got whatever's at number 1 spliced onto the back of the ARPL sample. Last of all, we've got the Together feature at number 3, which will create a straightforward layered mix between the second sample nominated on page 10 and the first sample nominated on page 1. So with this option, as it's named, you can splice or crossfade any two samples. If you wanted a perfect slice from, say, a piano into a string with no fade, you'd choose option 1 or 2, but jump back to page 11 and reduce the crossfade time to 0. Alternatively, if you wanted a fade between the two, you would dial in a crossfade time amount like we have here. But again, there's no undo, so copy or save your samples if you can't afford to mess them up. And so with this feature, you should really consider which option to take first, and then visit page 11 to set the amount of crossfade time if you need any at all. Also, there's a little trap you should watch out for. The thing with the crossfade rendering is that you'll get mixed playback speeds if the sample rates differ from each other. So it may take a little resampling to get them to match correctly, so be prepared for a little bit of trial and error. There's also a trick I used to do on these old samplers years ago to squeeze more sample time out of the unit. And with a feature like this, I'd use it like a pseudo bounce or render process where you could potentially take 2 drum loops, bounce them down to 1, which might save you a little more memory as well as another voice. So moving along to page 13, where we have the crossfade loop function. This feature tries to assist with those difficult to loop samples in that it blends out the loop point to help your loops cross over more seamlessly. So here you have a crossfade length in microseconds, and you provide a new name for the newly rendered crossfaded sample that should then loop more smoothly. So we'll just give this a meaningful name. So I'll leave the length as much as I can get. If I hit execute, it'll work out what the maximum length can be. Oh, but before I execute that, I should just play you what we're currently working with. I've got a loop here that's actually got a little click on it. So if you listen, you can hear the little click. And so now when I execute this, it should attempt to smooth that out. Okay, so let's try looking up pad X, go back to the front, pad X, and now let's try playing this back. So that's smoothed that little glitch out. So on to page 14, we've got the VX Time Skew, which is the velocity crossfade time skew, although in my opinion, this really should have been called the velocity crossfade delay, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what this is. So to put a lot of those rumours to bed, it's not a time stretch as you can find on the S950. What it does is delays the start of one of your samples that resides inside that velocity crossfade layer. And so the thing is, this feature requires an already existing velocity crossfade sample. So if you don't already have a velocity layered sample in the 900's memory, you'll need to load one up or create one via page 15 first. And make sure you're monitoring via a velocity crossfade configured program and not the direct monitor on page 2. Otherwise, you won't be able to hear your crossfade layers. You'll just hear one or the other. So there's more coming up on that a little later inside the program chapters. But to give you an idea of how it works, I've currently got a soft sample selected on page 1. So if we go to page 14, and then I give my sample a new name, Xfade-1, as you can see here, then go down to this delay soft and choose 1. You'll see the memory double, which means it's actually processed the Xfade 1 sample. Now if we go back to the start and select Xfade Notice when I hit playback, the delay between when I press the button and when the sound comes out. And that's the delay. So not a big deal, but at least you know what that is and how it works. And just before we move off this feature, you can key in up to 32,000 points, which equates to 32 milliseconds, but that depends on the sample rate and the length of your sample as well, and how much memory you've got left. And like many other functions on the 900, you will need to have your velocity crossfade sample selected on page 1. Once you've done that, then jump back into page 14 and enter in the name for the new velocity crossfade sample. And after you've done that, select which of the two layers you want to have delayed. So moving on to the last page in the edit sample section, we've got page 15, which is the velocity layer creation page, or what the 900 refers to as the loud soft sample page. This is for creating velocity crossfade samples where you can have a loud sample and a soft sample coupled together. If you strike the keys softly, you'll just get the soft sample. And when you do the opposite, striking the keys hard, you'll only hear the sample nominated as loud. But keep in mind, when using crossfade samples, you'll be using 2 voices for every crossfade sample, as well as 2 key groups too. The M in this top right corner, I presume, is a label for the amount of memory that's being used below. And to the left of that, you can see this strange little cross character with a arrow pointing downwards. And that's there to indicate that we've currently got a crossfade sample selected, which is possible if you want to overwrite an already existing velocity crossfade sample. But again, I should stress the S900 does not have an undo feature. So save your samples if you can't afford to mess them up. If you're not planning to overwrite, you can cursor into this little section here and key in a new name for your new velocity crossfade sample. And then we can just go down to create VX for velocity crossfade and hit enter. And you'll see the memory jump up when it's finished rendering the new sample. So now we've got a few different types of samples in the S900 memory. Now we can head over to the edit program section and allocate our samples into key groups so that we can play the various samples we have inside our programs. So starting with page 1 of the edit program section, we can manage the programs inside the S900 in a similar fashion to the way we did with the first page on the edit sample section. You can have up to 32 programs in memory simultaneously, and you can copy, rename, delete, and select other programs, very similar to the way you can select your samples in the sample section. If you're unfamiliar with how to get around on this page and use these features, then check out the navigation chapter. So moving on to page 2, we've got the key loudness page. This adds a level of bias across the span of your keyboard. So a value of +50 is quiet down the left or low end of your keyboard, while louder up the high end of your keyboard. Opposed to a value of -50, which is loud down the low end of the keyboard, and quiet up the high end. If the positional crossfade is enabled by using the on button on the keypad, the key loudness won't use the full range of the keyboard, but rather the overlapping sections of your key groups as that transition range. For example, if you've got one sample going from C1 to C4 and another going from C2 to C6, then the bias range will be from C2 to C4. And so now moving up to page 3, we've got the key groups. And key groups are responsible for where and how samples play across your keyboard. So this is really the S900's nerve center. And on this page, we can create however many key groups we need, of up to 64 key groups per program. And so if you navigate down to this section here, you can use the plus and minus keys to copy the key groups. And you can see up here, we've got number 5 selected. So if I wanted to, I could actually change that to 3. and then just copy 3 by hitting plus again. Or I could just hit the minus button and keep deleting them. And another cool feature we have is the put and get functions, which are over here, which give you the ability to copy key groups to other programs, which is really handy if you've already got a kit set up but want to copy a kick or a snare to another program, along with any particular tuning, envelope, key range settings that are related to that particular key group. So it'd make more sense if it was labeled copy and paste, because ultimately that's what it is, but unfortunately it's put and get. And if you make a mental note, just remember that put is copy and get is paste. Bit of an old school convention there, but it works just the same. So moving on to page 4, we've got the velocity crossfade mix, and this feature can only be used with velocity crossfade samples. So to enable that, you have to cursor over to this little section and click the on button. The 50% mix at velocity allows you to play either loud or soft samples by hitting the keys with a particular force of velocity. The bias point between the loud and the soft samples by default has a value of 64 that we can see here. This allows you to gently touch the keys to play the soft sample or hit the keys hard to play the loud sample, but you can offset that center of gravity, if we can call it that, by shifting this value in either direction of 64, which will give you more of one than the other. For example, you may want less soft sample and more loud sample, or vice versa, based on how hard you strike the keys. And using this bias point at 64, you can lift that mix offset higher or lower. Would have been nice to have this capped at 100, so a velocity value of 50 is actually 50% mix, but then MIDI registers have 128 values, so it had to adhere to that particular convention. Anyway, on to page 5, the key group range and soft sample setting. Despite the fact on the panel menu it says sample name, this page is where you allocate the range for your samples across your keyboard by key group. And on the left you can see this little KG, which represents your currently selected key group, and here you can select any one single key group or use your control dial to select all key groups, which will allow you to edit all the key groups at the same time. And to do that, you first start with the low key, so you can see there that the 808 is now on C3. And if I move the low key up one note, the 808's not making a noise because it's now out of range. So we can put that key back there and we can hear the 808 again. And so you'd first start with the low key and then figure out where exactly you want your keys to actually shine through. And don't concern yourself too much with the fact that they're numbers, because they're very handy if you're using something like an SP1200 or an MPC, because the pads will actually send through MIDI note numbers, which will make a whole lot more sense than the notes on a keyboard. So you want to set the high key and the low key to whatever range you need. So as you scroll through the numbers here, you'll notice that the keys also change with it. So that's just giving you a bit of a guide in case you've got a MIDI keyboard. The original pitch, or the nominal pitch, is displayed up here on the top right. You can't change that here. You have to go back to page 3 on the edit sample section, and that's just indicating what the original pitch is for that particular sample. And so under soft sample there, you can arrow into this little position here and scroll through the currently available samples in the 900's memory, and use a playback button to audition them. And that pretty much covers everything on that page. So let's move up to page 6. This is where we can mess around with our pitch and our filter and our loudness per key group. So you can boost or cut the loudness of your samples in the selected key group. You can choose all your key groups, and you can pitch your samples up and down using the fine tuning or the transpose. But I should mention the S up here on the left indicates that this is a soft sample layer. So if you're wanting to set up a velocity crossfade sample, you can edit these same parameters for your loud layer on page 8. But if you're not using a velocity crossfade sample, then just disregard the S and disregard page 8. So moving up to page 7, here you can add a loud sample for your selected key group here, and you can also set a specific keyboard range using a low key and high key range value. But the thing here is that you won't be able to add a loud sample into this field unless the velocity switch threshold on page 4 is less than 128. So in other words, you can't add a loud sample if the soft sample is hogging up the entire velocity range. The 900 just won't let you put your cursor into this field. It's quite stubborn like that. Moving on to page 8, we've got the loud sample loudness. Much like page 6, here you can edit some parameters for the loud sample layer, like overall filter, along with your pitch adjustments in semitones or fine tuning. I won't bother with the loud sample. We've seen what a soft sample can do. Moving up to page 9, the envelope page, which is a fairly common ADSR envelope. You've got attack, decay, sustain, release, and you can also select, like the other pages, which particular key group you want to edit, and you can select all if you want to edit all the key groups with the same setting. So we'll just put that back to 1, and I've just loaded in a pad sound, so what we can do is shape that up a bit, add some release, and I might get some more key range out of that, so we'll go back to here, put that all the way down the bottom, put that up to C6, so that playback button's just actually triggering C3, but if I try to play like a fifth or a chord, and if I just go back to the filter, I might just dull that filter down a bit. So that's the envelope page, which is quite nice for contouring your sounds. Moving on to page 10, we're getting into some interesting territory now. On this page, you can harness the dynamic nature of your playing to further shape certain characteristics of your samples. Again, by selecting a single key group, or all, you can control various elements of your sample, such as the attack, loudness, release time, and filter, to be impacted by how hard or how soft you hit the keys. So I suggest you experiment with this feature. Just don't forget to enable it, where it says off. Switch that to on. And With values less than 50 on your filter, you can add some lovely expressiveness by playing a little harder on the keys to open up that filter. And you can dial in some attack or release values. So striking the keys a little harder will shorten the attack or release times, as well as add some additional loudness if you dial in a little bit of that value too. And so these features work really well with long decay and release times. So if you have some pad sounds you want to mess with, go to page 9, shape up some ADSR values on your pads, and then come back to this page, because this feature, in my opinion, is a little bit of an underutilized feature of the S900, and it can really make pad type sounds shine through that warm filter. So moving on to page 11, we've got the warp feature, which is kind of like a basic pitch envelope, where you can set the duration of time in the top right, followed by an attack offset, which is more or less the direction of where the pitch will either rise or fall from. A positive value will start the pitch high, whereas a negative value will start the pitch low. And then from either side, it'll rise up back to the original pitch of your sample within this time frame that you've set here. You can also dial in a velocity value here, which will then allow some pressure sensitivity to control how much impact this feature has on your sample. And like most of the other pages here under Edit Program, you can select any one key group or all if you want to edit the same values across all your key groups. And as a tip, if you have some brass sounds, you can give a little bit of a zhuzh to the attack of your brass sounds on different key groups, and then it makes them a little bit more realistic and adds a little pizzazz to your brass. So moving on to page 12, here we have the low frequency oscillator, and it should be said that the S900 has 8 LFOs that can run in sync with each other when the desync is set on, opposed to when the desync is off. Each voice of the S900 will have its own LFO playing out, slightly out of sync with the other voices, which can be really useful in replicating the characteristics of old out-of-tune synthesizers. So like the pages before it, you can edit the key group for one particular key group or all to apply your LFO settings across all key groups. The LFO depth is responsible for dialing in the strength of the low frequency oscillator or the amplitude. The rate is responsible for dialing in how fast the oscillation of your LFO is. And the delay will control how much time goes by before the LFO starts up. And so moving on to page 13, the LFO depth. Similar to page 12, 13 has some carryover features belonging to the LFO, such as the aftertouch and mod wheel. So if I was to play a C3 and dial in a bit of mod wheel on my MIDI keyboard, and if I was to apply some aftertouch, so in regard to aftertouch, if you dial in any value up to 99 and push down hard on the keys, you'll hear a vibrato type of effect, and that's largely the result of the settings from page 12, but also from the added pressure on the keys after you play a note. And like the pages before it, you can select one key group or all the key groups to edit your LFO settings. And so moving on to page 14, here we have 3 options to choose from. Here we've got constant pitch, which removes any tonal changes in pitch across the span of the keyboard. And this is mostly useful for when you're trying to cut a loop into individual sections. This will remove the pitch, so as you slice your drums across the keys, you don't have to manually reduce the pitch on each sample as your kit progresses up the keyboard. So if I play a D and a C together, all the notes I play now will just be playing at that nominal pitch that we set when we sampled the sound in to start with. There's also this one-shot feature which, before this particular version of operating system, created a lot of heartache for SB1200 owners and other drum machine owners for that matter, but it's now been resolved in this version 4 operating system. So if you enable this using the on button, the sample completes its duration no matter what, which is really handy for drum loops and longer percussion samples if you're triggering the S900 from something like an SB1200 or a 909 or some other type of drum machine like an MPC or whatever. And again, this particular feature can be edited per key group or all key groups as a whole. And getting over to the key filter, here you can set a little bit of a bias of a filter up and down the keyboard range. So if I was to hold down, I'll turn this off first. If I was to hold down C2, So it just gives a little bit more control over the brightness up and down the range of your keyboard. Okay, so moving on to page 15. Here we have a few MIDI settings pertaining to this particular program we're working on. And here you could potentially set up key groups to receive MIDI across various MIDI channels. Now, I'm not sure how useful this could be to anyone. It's not really an application I've ever needed with an S900, as 64 samples across one keyboard is fairly comprehensive. And seeing that you can't select more than one program at a time on the S900, it doesn't really leave you with much choice. So, however, having said that, if you did have a situation where you need one program to receive MIDI from multiple channels, like a bass sample on the lower half of your keyboard receiving MIDI on channel 1, and have some drums or some vocals up the right end of the keyboard receiving MIDI on channels 2 and 3, you could literally edit the key group you want to receive on other MIDI channels. And you could key in a channel number for that here. So here we can see that key group 1 will receive MIDI across all MIDI channels. And this option is related to the Omni setting found on the first page of the MIDI section. So if your Omni setting is on, then this setting will be fixed to all. And so if Omni is off, then we can mess around with these values here and assign your key groups to their own independent MIDI channel values. So moving on to page 16, the output voices. Much like more recent or modern Akai samplers, here on the output page we have access to the rear outputs of the S900. And while 8 outputs is cool, it should be said that these 8 outputs are single voice outputs, as in they're mono. So if you're trying to recreate a piano sound, you're going to have to use the mix out or the main out. The individual outputs will allow one voice per channel, and so a second voice put through the same channel will cut out the first. This might be okay for drum loops in certain situations, but if you need polyphonic voices, you're going to have to use the mix out at all 0. And it should be said that the left and right output that you have pan control for here on the front as a secondary dial also are single voice outputs. So it's a little tricky trying to get a pad out the main left and right in true stereo. It can be done if you layer the same sound across 2 key groups and then allocate each key group to the left and the right. But let's face it, the S900 was never intended to be a stereo sampler. And again, like the pages before it, the key group here can be edited singularly or as a group for all the key groups. And so finally, moving on to page 17 of the Edit Program section, we've got the filter envelope. And you can dial in an envelope curve that the filter follows, much like the amp envelope on page 9. It's a traditional ADSR envelope, so you can dial in some duration for the attack, the decay and the sustain, and some release time, and finally the amount of how dominant that filter is over your sample. The thing to note is here, if your filter is all the way open on page 6, or possibly even page 8, if you're using a loud sample as well, then you won't hear this envelope working its magic. You'll need to pull the filter down on those pages so that this filter amount takes priority or has a ceiling to push through. Similar to the pages before it, you can edit a single key group or all key groups so they share the same filter envelope settings. So moving on to the MIDI section now. Here on page 1, you can configure the S900 to accept MIDI connections on any one particular MIDI channel. If Omni is on, then the left-hand channel setting is ignored and the S900 will accept MIDI on any channel, opposed to when Omni's off. Then the channel number on the left is the only channel MIDI reception will be accepted on. And you can choose any number between 1 and 16 for reception of MIDI data. Moving on to page 2. We have the MIDI test page, and this allows you to configure your playback button or PB button, which is useful when the default value for the velocity isn't enough. You can also change the MIDI number, and you can also change the key that the PB button triggers as well, which is very handy if you don't have a keyboard directly connected and you need to test various settings across your key groups. So I'll leave that at 127. So moving on to page 3, the MIDI receive monitor. So if you're having trouble figuring out if your sequencer is getting through to the S900, then use this page to see what's being received. So if I touch on the keyboard now, if I touch a C4 or a C5 or a G, and you can also see the velocity that I'm hitting at as well. So if I touch it very softly, so yeah, very handy utility there. So moving on to page 4, this is the page you come to nominate the pitch wheel range. You can have up to 12 semitones, which is an octave. You can also enable or disable the reception of MIDI program changes or MIDI volume by cursoring over to these fields and hitting either on or off on the keypad. So just to give you a demo, that's all the way down on the bender. I think my synth wheel is a little bit too sensitive for the S900. Anyway, moving on to page 5, we have the RS232C serial port configuration page. This is where you could set up the S900 to receive MIDI via the serial port on the rear, but as mentioned earlier, you'd need an older computer like an Atari 520 ST or some bespoke hardware to make use of this. So this particular setting is best left on option 1 for normal communication over MIDI cables. Moving along to the utility section, which is currently not present, as you can see. This is for use with the Akai ASK90 trigger board, so we'll have to leave this as I don't have that hardware option installed, unfortunately. But in short, the ASK90 is an audio to MIDI trigger that is an optional accessory available to the S900 only. And that allows you to trigger 8 sounds or possibly more if the velocity crossfade samples allow it. So let's move on to the disk section. Page 1 we have is clear memory and load. Here you can purge the contents of the S900's memory and load all the contents of the disk in one press of a button. Moving on to page 2. On page 2 we can load programs by cursoring up to the PR and hitting the Enter button to execute a load command, or we can load the programs along with the samples it uses by selecting samples and then hitting the Enter button. If we move up to page 3, we can load a single sample irrespective of whichever program it may be using. And if we go to page 4, here we can delete a sample from disk and save contents of the S900 memory. On page 5, we can save a program only or save a program and its related samples. And then on page 6, you can save a single sample from the S900's memory. On page 7, you have erase from disk, which is like a utility that allows you to browse the samples or programs on disk and erase them one at a time. And then on page 8, you have disk format, which is what you will need to do if you've got these floppies. And last of all, on page 10, you can choose to compress the samples to disk as they save. But I wouldn't advise you do that, as they could come back sounding a little different to what they sounded like at the time you sampled them. So experiment with this at your own peril. Use the off button on the keypad to disable this feature, and by default it's on. So yeah, you might want to experiment with that. I haven't yet, but I just choose not to save my stuff with compression on. So now for the master tune. As the name says, the amount here affects all the samples or programs inside the S900. So this should really be left at 0 in order to adhere to the 440 Hz pitch standard of tuning. So all the way left we have the play section. This is where your programs reside for easy access. I can't say I've had that many times where I've had more than one program, and simply because there's not a lot of sample time in the S900, so it's not like you could have a library of pianos sitting in there. But you could have a few different drum kits with short, sharp, one-shot samples, but if you do manage to create multiple programs, you can browse them through here, horizontally too, which I think is really cool. And then you would select whichever one you want and hit the enter key. And if you're savvy enough with your sequencer, you can use program changes to automatically send the corresponding numbers from 1 upwards to access your various programs inside the S900. Last of all, I'll show you a method to check your RAM chips to see if they pass muster. Hold down these 3 keys, 0, on and off, and then let go and hit the letter button. Now it might take a few seconds or more, but then you should get a little notification in the top left that the RAM is okay. All right, great. So that just about covers everything I know about the S900. And I hope that's put a lot of questions to rest and helped you turn any confusion into creation. If it has, let me know by hitting the thumbs up, subscribe, and check out the channel for more clips just like this one. If there's any feedback or questions, feel free to drop them in the comments section below. If you like, jump onto Instagram and check out the TONELAB profile. Alternatively, drop by the Facebook group for tech tips, troubleshooting. Thanks for watching, take care, and bye for now.